Good afternoon, everybody. My name's David Goodman. I'm the director of the China Studies Centre here at the University of Sydney. I'm speaking to you from the Gadigal land of the Eora people. And before we go any further, we should acknowledge their unceded right to the land on which the university is based and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. It's a great pleasure today to introduce a topic on porcelain in China, not least because when I first started as a junior lecturer back in the early 1970s, I went to do a lecture on China, on Chinese politics actually, in Cambridge at the Workers' Education Association. And it was advertised as China, the country, not the clay. So it's a great pleasure to actually hear about the clay today. Secondly, it's a great pleasure too, because the moderator for today's session is another old friend, Claire Roberts, she and I were students together in Beijing more years ago than either of us would care to remember. I'll pass over to her in a minute, but before I do that, if you come to ask questions for the end of the lecture and presentation, please put them in the Q&A facility at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and that will enable us to quiz Alex as he answers questions that Claire puts. Okay, over to you, Claire. I'll let you introduce Alex.
Thank you very much, David. It's a great pleasure to be part of this conversation today, hosted by David and involving Alex Burchmore, Dr. Alex Burchmore. Alex and I go back quite a way, and so it's a really proud moment actually for me to be having this conversation with him, in the context of the publication of his first kind of major monograph, publication. Just briefly, Alex has got the most extraordinary CV. He began, many people may not know, undertaking a Bachelor of Visual Arts at the University of South Australia. His academic excellence was recognised at that time, and he switched from being a visual arts practitioner. And Alex, we must have a conversation about your practice back then. I realise I'm not as familiar with that as I should be. But then he segued into art history and conducted research, gaining an MA in art history and an MA in curatorial studies at the University of Adelaide. Alex took up Chinese, well, not at the earliest kind of juncture of his career, but at an important juncture in his career. And really took to the language. He had great motivation, enrolled in Chinese language classes in Adelaide, and then went on to receive the Prime Minister's Australia-Asia Award, which took him to Beijing. He's since spent times subsequently in Beijing and in Taiwan, and he gained his PhD in Asian art history from the Australian National University after having studied or began the PhD at the University of Adelaide. Alex's CV, as I mentioned, is quite extraordinary. He's published so many articles that have led up to this particular moment, the publication of his monograph. He's currently a lecturer in Museum and Heritage Studies at the University of Adelaide. He's also won numerous prizes. So look, it's a great pleasure, as I mentioned, to be part of this conversation and to draw Alex out a little bit on the topic that's been his focus for many years now. With its focus on porcelain, Alex's book, New Export China, Translations Across Time and Place in Contemporary Chinese Porcelain Art, is pioneering. It offers us, and this is in Alex's word, a multifaceted definition of New Export China as both a category of artistic practice and a theoretical framework for approaching contemporary art in general. It's complex, yet written with great clarity and a pleasure to read. This is not something that is easily achieved. The format of the session is that I'll ask Alex a series of questions, and then in the last period of our conversation, we'll open the floor to questions, as David said. So please put them in the chat function as we go, and I'll take them one by one. I've got many more questions than we've got time for, so we'll just jump straight in. And I wanted to really, Alex, start at the beginning and ask you why porcelain? How did you come to settle on this topic for your thesis, and what was involved, if you'd like to share with us, what was involved in transforming the thesis into this handsome publication?
It's a good question. Why porcelain? I guess what really appealed to me about the material was just that it kind of crosses so many boundaries. So it's something that's very familiar and almost humble and domestic. So we use it every day. We perhaps don't even think about the fact that we're using it for various bodily functions. But it's also something that historically has been so exotic and so mysterious at first. So, I mean, I guess that the old mythologized history is that porcelain was obviously created in China, or perhaps not obviously, but most of you might know that porcelain was created in China many centuries ago and exported from China around the world. And initially in Europe particularly, people had no idea how it was made, and they thought it was this almost magical substance. So it took on this mythology of being made of any number of quite strange things or strange processes. So it brought that, even when they realized and worked out how to emulate what they purchased, it brought that magic and mythology with it. So it's got this wonderful tension, and it's also got these material qualities that really appeal to me in terms of being very fragile. Obviously, it's easy to smash a porcelain vessel, but at the same time, very durable. In that, if it's buried underground, or if it's kept well, even in a cupboard or something, it can last for thousands of years, essentially unchanged. It's quite incredible how stable it can remain over time. So it was both those material qualities and the history of it, and the way in which that linked with the kind of humble aspects of it that really appealed to me. And I found myself drawn to the work of Xian in particular, whose art I spoke about a couple of days ago. Some of you might have been there in another public talk. And his busts, his China busts, that was really the first works of, I guess, what could be called porcelain art, or what I like to call new export China, that I came across, and that I really wanted to explore why he chose porcelain and what porcelain meant to him. In terms of how I transformed the thesis into the book, Claire didn't mention that she was my supervisor throughout the doctorate, so she had a kind of first-hand view of the thesis developing over many years. I mean, the book and the thesis, they're quite similar. The content is essentially the same, but when I had submitted it and I started thinking about how to turn it into a book, I had the good fortune of having written it in a style that was quite amenable to being turned into a book, and I thought the content was something that a lot of people would enjoy. But I adapted it a bit, and we might get later into some of the structure of the thing. But I adapted it, and I kind of worked out how to frame it in a way that looked ahead. So in the thesis, it was predominantly quite backward facing. It was sort of a reflection on the four artists whose works I'd chosen and how they used porcelain. And then in the book, I wanted it to be more expansive and to look ahead, perhaps, to how that analysis and how that type of work might develop in the future. So I suppose that's the main difference in terms of how I adapted it.
Thanks, Alex. And maybe share with us or talk to us a bit about New Export China, this concept that is the title of the book.
That was another thing that I had to really think about with the book, because when I approached different presses, they sort of asked, what is New Export China? Quite justifiably. And what do you mean by that? And how does it differ? The readers for the book, especially the reviewers, wanted to know how it differed from other forms of ceramic art and what I was actually trying to do, and that why didn't I mention these artists, or why didn't I mention these works? So I guess what I arrived at was this idea of a particular form of contemporary ceramic art, so art which I guess uses ceramics, which is very conceptually based. So it's driven by ideas, And the ideas can be linked to the material qualities of ceramic in terms of durability, fragility, the idea of fragments and that sort of thing. But I found that the works that I was looking at, the artists that I was studying, they were more driven by the ideas and the concepts, the history, the kind of social, political resonance of the material. So that was one aspect of it. Another aspect of it was the tension between the present and the past. So I wanted the phrase "new export China" to kind of conjure both the sense of something being new, and that it was very linked to contemporary concerns, contemporary, I guess, anxieties in a way, contemporary aspirations and ambitions, but it was also something that was very historically embedded, which is why I put the term export in there, because it looks back on the export trade, the China trade, and the artists I look at are all very aware of that history. So history is a large part of it, but history in the sense of something that's constructed in the present. And then China playing on the pun that, well, not pun, I guess the homonym that David mentioned in his introduction between China and China in English. So we tend to call ceramics China because of their origin in China. So I wanted to kind of draw that out, because that again was a key aspect of the material for the artists I was looking at, the link between ceramics and China.
So Alex, I just wanted to now turn to the structure of the book. You know, the book has a really deceptively simple structure. There are 4 chapters, which you title Porcelain Production, Porcelain Past, Porcelain Renaissance, and Porcelain Clay. And as you mentioned earlier, you focus on analyzing the work of, well, not only the work, but also the working lives of 4 artists, Liu Jianhua, Weiwei, Sin-ying Ho, a female artist, which is very nice to see, and Xian, also great to see an Australian artist there in the mix. But you don't simply analyze the work of one artist in each chapter. Ideas of mobility, trans-experience, and really a dynamic relationality lie at the heart of the book. So can you talk to us a bit about the structure of the book, how it's designed to work, and the significance of you know, one of the really key concepts that is underlined in the book, the concept of trans-experience?
Yeah, the structure, I sort of deliberately wanted to keep it simple to, I guess it is a bit of deception, but it does sort of mask the complexity. So running briefly through, the 4 chapters are intended to point to what I saw as 4 general motivations or general aspects of appeal of porcelain that had attracted the 4 artists. So the first chapter, Porcelain Production, and I sequenced them in a way that I thought spoke to the prevalence of those motivations. So the first one, Porcelain Production, focuses on the making of porcelain and the ideas of mass production and modularity that are so essential to porcelain as something which was mass produced in huge quantities for centuries in millions and millions of pieces and exported around the world en masse. So there's an enormous amount of porcelain in the world. And also the idea that those are modular. So the way in which it was produced through a division of labor, whereby every person in that process was highly specialized in a particular aspect of the process. So one person would be painting perhaps one motif on an endless number of different vessels and different types of porcelain. And that was something that, again, very much appealed to contemporary artists, because it was an opportunity for them to create work that had those elements of mass and modularity and interchangeability, and to explore things on a huge scale, but also in quite a cost-effective way. So I also explore in that chapter the points of collaboration and the working relationships between artists and the artisans in Jingdezhen, which is a city in South China, very tied to porcelain, where a lot of artists go to work with artisans. So that chapter was very much about, I guess, the logistics of it in a way. Porcelain Past, the second chapter, looks at the attraction of the history of porcelain, which again was something very, very central to its appeal. But not just kind of in a way where artists would reflect on that history and bring it into the present and communicate it, but actually interrogating the history and deconstructing the history and using porcelain as almost a lens to deconstruct other aspects of history, and even to deconstruct the way in which we think of historical narratives as a mode of addressing the past. So it was very much to do with, again, drawing on that longevity of porcelain, some of the historic characteristics of it, and just using that as a lens. Porcelain Renaissance was more about the appeal of porcelain as an aspect of personal identity as well as cultural identity, and the links between those two and the way in which they blur. So that was more about artists, predominantly artists who live outside of China, who have turned to porcelain as a way to reclaim their identity almost. But again, like in the second chapter, it wasn't just a matter of reclaiming their identity and using porcelain to communicate it, but it often became, again, quite an interrogatory process, whereby they would come to realize through porcelain that their identity was something that was very constructed, that it was sort of ongoing. It was a project without an end, in a way. Then finally, porcelain clay returns, I guess, to the material qualities of porcelain, and the way in which the kind of tactility of it, the analog between clay and flesh, the way in which that plays into works, and also some of even the sexual overtones of porcelain, as well as the way it links to ideas of the exotic and the kind of sexual undertones of the exotic as well. So it's a thematic structure, I suppose. So yeah, instead of focusing on one artist per chapter, I mean, there are emphases based on the different artists and their different focuses. So the first chapter predominantly focuses on Liu Jianhua and Weiwei, because their works lend themselves most, as we'll see soon when I show a few more slides, their works lend themselves to that idea of porcelain en masse. The second chapter continues that focus on them with elements of a few other artists. Porcelain Renaissance is predominantly Xian, Sin-ying Ho as the two artists. I mean, Ai Weiwei also lives outside of China at the moment, but Xian and Sin-ying Ho have most extensively explored their identity in relationship to porcelain. And porcelain clay brings them all back together in a way, because they've all been attracted by that material quality of porcelain. And underneath it all, as you mentioned, is the idea of trans experience and the way in which that links to mobility and relationality and things like that. So in our current climate, trans experience perhaps conjures different thoughts for many people, but the term itself has nothing to do with trans people. It's to do with the prefix trans, which kind of means across or between or through or yeah, across, between, through, moving between states. And the word trans experience was coined by another artist, Chen, who is sadly no longer with us. He hasn't been with us for a long time. Who incorporated into his practice and used it as a way to describe his own experience of moving between cultures and between contexts, and his sense that it was part of his identity, and it was quite a central part of his identity, and that it was something that shouldn't be perhaps moved away from or concealed, but something that he wanted to embrace and champion. And it was almost, he saw it as a way of being at home nowhere, but at the same time at home everywhere, and kind of drawing from lots of different things. And I felt that was something that very much spoke to not only porcelain as a material that's been called the pilgrim art, because it's traveled so far across the world and it's found a home in so many contexts, and it can move so easily between contexts, but also the four artists that I had chosen, I felt they also kind of spoke to this trans experiential way of looking at the world, in terms of not being fixed within a specific context or a specific place, but moving very much between them and embracing that mobility.
Yeah, the four artists that you've chosen, Alex, they're all very different, and they each have had different levels of engagement with porcelain over the course of their careers to date. Can you tell us how and why you chose them? And maybe this is a good opportunity for us to kind of look at some examples of their work as you speak.
Well, I should say this is a piece by Sin-ying Ho on the cover of the book. I'll talk a bit about. I've got another piece to show of hers in a while, but it's just a wonderful piece that I thought very much fit the theme, so I wanted to see it on the cover. And it's wonderful to see a woman artist, a woman's work gracing the cover of the book, I thought. So Liu Jianhua, I guess, is kind of, well, he's really the first artist in China who engaged with porcelain and ceramics on a level that had the kind of conceptualism that I was thinking of. He started his life, his professional career, I suppose, as an assembly line ceramicist in Jingdezhen. When he was only 17, he was apprenticed to his uncle, who was a ceramicist as well. And he was producing mostly socialist, realist sculpture at the time. He did that for about a decade, and then he almost had a revulsion for porcelain, I think, after doing that for so long, and turned away from it for about a decade again, and went on to study to become a contemporary artist in an academic sense. And he is now a professor, I believe. And then he returned to porcelain actually another 10 years down the line, but in a different way. So he returned to it in a way that was very driven by concept and was driven by some of the things that he learned, I guess, when he was studying to become an artist, and some of the things that he picked up in his career as an artist. And I chose him really because of that relationship to porcelain over the longer period, and because of the particular experience that he brought to it. So Clement, you mentioned that they each have a different attitude, and they each have a different level of engagement with the material. So his was very much driven by that early apprenticeship and his really almost muscle memory training in how to make porcelain objects, which at the same time contributed, I think, to a bit of a ambivalence in his mind, because it was something that he, I think, struggled to think of as a material that he could use in a contemporary artistic sense. And it is a material that, perhaps not so now, but a couple of decades ago, wasn't really seen as something fitting for artists. It was seen as something kitsch or low, or not really high enough or elite enough, not to the same level of bronze or marble or things like that. I won't talk too much about him. Ai Weiwei, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with Ai Weiwei. This is perhaps his most well-known work in ceramics or in porcelain, sunflower seeds, the 100 million sunflower seeds, which he produced with the help of artisans in Jingdezhen. This is also perhaps the best known work that exemplifies that mass aesthetic in porcelain, because really the overwhelming effect of it is one of mass, one of accumulation, just sheer weight, basically. So his relationship with porcelain, he didn't have the training that Liu Jianhua had. He did, in fact, visit not Jingdezhen, but he visited Cizhou in the late 70s for a few months, and produced a little owl, which some people see as his first work of art. So it could be said that he started his career as a ceramicist. Obviously, he didn't go back to it until a couple decades later. But his relationship with porcelain, I found, was very much driven by its history, and as a kind of mediating thing. So in addition to being an artist, he's also quite a prolific collector of ceramics and other antiquities, which he started picking up in the early 90s in the markets of Beijing after he had returned to the city from New York, where he studied for a little while, for about a decade. And I think he found in it a way to connect to that history, but also a way to connect with his father, Ai Qing, who also had a collection of porcelain that he very carefully maintained, or friends of his maintained, during the years of their exile in Xinjiang. And also with his brother, one of his brothers, who was very much a connoisseur of porcelain and guided him through the markets. So I see it as a link between that cultural and social history, but also family history for him. And then it took on new resonance as he used it as a way to interrogate some of those histories and some of those forms of relationship. Sin-ying Ho. Sin-ying Ho is the only one of the four who really fits the definition of what we perhaps think of as a ceramic artist. She's a studio ceramicist, which means that she does it all herself. She forms the clay, she paints the clay, she glazes the clay, she bakes the clay, she does it all herself. She's trained to do that. She's studied in Canada, she studied in New York, she currently lives in New York. She's the only one of the four who actually fits that definition. And her works are very much what we might expect, I suppose, of a studio ceramicist, but with a very with a flair that speaks to her background. So this is one of her earliest pieces for public display identity. which pretty much encapsulates her use of porcelain. So if you can see in the image, the designs are actually made up of letters, which are the letters of her name, or her chosen English name, Cassandra, as well as her Chinese name. And she's got decals, which are images that are kind of impressed upon the surface of the porcelain using heat, of various identity documents that she's had over time. So she's got her Canadian passport, she's got her green card, she's got her Hong Kong ID. And it was intended, she said at the time, that it was intended as something which would look like an ordinary piece of export ware, because she was, again, very interested in the history of porcelain, but that on closer inspection would reveal all these layers. So it can be seen almost as an analogy for the experience of a migrant, in a way, because you're moving between contexts, you're gathering all these documents. People judge you based on your appearance, but there's so much more beneath the surface going on. And her works deal a lot with that idea, and with that idea of jumbling those things together and mixing them up. And finally, Xian, who is perhaps, apart from Weiwei, perhaps most familiar to those of you who are here today, and who I spoke about a couple days ago. He has actually only produced one series in porcelain, the China series. It's a substantial series. It has 80 busts in it, busts of family, friends, also of models in Jingdezhen. So his relationship to porcelain is part of a larger project where he makes use of traditional materials, things like bronze and lacquer, but also things like scholars' rocks, cloisonné, things like that. And he, again, like Ai Weiwei, has spent a lot of time in the markets of Beijing. He grew up in Beijing before he moved to Australia. And it's really about, for him, I think, reclaiming a sense of heritage and almost reclaiming these things that I think he felt had been overlooked or perhaps forgotten or undervalued at the time when he was doing it. So this was in the 90s. And doing something new with them, testing their limits as well, testing the limits of the material, is very driven by not only by the cultural resonance of it and the personal resonance for him, but also by that material resonance, which I guess is why he's tried his hand at so many different materials. And like Ai Weiwei, he works quite closely with the artisans of Jingdezhen, but the relationship is very different. So Ai Weiwei's relationship with those artisans is very much one of contract labor almost, whereas the relationship between Xian and the artisans he works with is more of a collaboration. Liu Jianhua also works with artisans, but because a lot of them he knows from the time that he spent as a factory ceramicist, it's more of a friendly relationship. Yeah, so those are the four artists, and yeah, the four different attitudes they have, I guess.
No, thanks, Alex. I was really fascinated by the chronology of new export porcelain that you include in the book, beginning in 1950. And among the many entries, you mentioned, of course, that Liu Jianhua, began his apprenticeship in Jingdezhen in 1977, as you just mentioned. And in many ways, he's, one of the really important pioneers of contemporary porcelain art in China. Then in 1994, Xu Yihui, an artist whose work we know in the context of gaudy art and kind of political pop, but primarily gaudy art, traveled to Jingdezhen. And then in 1996, we have your other three chosen artists, Xian, Ai Weiwei, and Sin-ying Ho, all traveling to Jingdezhen in 1996. So, I mean, why? What's happening then?
It was quite a surprise for me to find that they all traveled there in the same year. I asked if they overlapped and met each other, but they didn't, which is almost more of a surprise, I think, in such a relatively small city. So what happened then? I mean, it comes down to the history of Jingdezhen, really. So I suppose almost you could say the fifth presence in the book is Jingdezhen and the history of it over the last 70 odd years, I guess, back to 1950. I started the chronology in 1950 because that was when obviously 1949, the People's Republic of China. But in Jingdezhen, the main effect of that was the creation of state-owned factories to make porcelain. So previously they had been, well, throughout the imperial era, there'd been an imperial factory and then a lot of private factories. But under the People's Republic, it became a state-owned and state-driven effort. And although the state publicly proclaimed an antagonism towards traditional things and traditional forms of art, they also sustained this production of porcelain for export as well as for things like, well, for some domestic sale, because it was lucrative, I suppose. And they also introduced this new line of making things like socialist realist sculpture. So the propaganda posters that perhaps everyone knows, there were also porcelain versions of those, which I find quite endearing. Some of them are very a little odd to see, but these little sculptures that would also be produced en masse and distributed around the country. So I started them because that was, I guess, the first transformation of Jingdezhen in the contemporary era. And then Liu Jianhua in the 70s, coming into that context, his uncle had already been in that context, learning his trade and his craft within that time, moving into the 80s and 90s. So he left in the mid 80s, 85, around the time of the 85 New Wave. And it was also a time when, of course, under Deng Xiaoping, China was shifting from state-owned industries towards more privatization and more market-based aspects. And in Jingdezhen, the main effect of that, again, was the dissolution of the state-owned factories and their closure, which created quite an economic impact, as you can imagine, and a rapid shift toward a more private base for industry. So in the 90s, that was all coming into fruition, and there were new studios were opening up, new ways of making porcelain were opening up. It transformed the industry. So rather than focusing on mass production, a lot of artisans now had to focus more on things that were things they could sell, things that they knew people wanted. And one of the main things was historic reproductions. So reproductions of predominantly Ming and Qing dynasty vessels. These were things they knew how to make. They were things that they could make very easily by looking at pattern books and at museum examples. And they were things that they knew how to ready market. So they started making a living doing that, and most of them actually made their living doing that. They also came to realize in the 90s that they could work with artists, because there were all these artists coming to Jingdezhen who were interested, I guess, by the medium, by the material, by the changes that were happening in the city. They were looking perhaps for, I don't know, for a hook, for a new thing that they might be able to adapt. With Xu Yihui, for example, and Gaudy art, he was attracted by the material qualities. So Gaudy art is almost like a subgenre, I guess, of political pop, but very much to do with commercial packaging and glamour and bringing in things like folk traditions, but repackaging them, I guess, in a way that's much more appealing for the contemporary era. And Xu Yihui saw porcelain as this really lush, luxurious, shiny, very appealing material that he wanted to experiment with under the kind of aesthetic of Gaudy art. So that was what drove him. And a lot of Liu Jianhua's early work was actually also in the almost a Gaudy art aesthetic, because he again dealt with that kind of approach. And yeah, why 1996? I mean, I suppose Sin-ying Ho ended up there because she actually undertook one of the earliest residencies. It was also in the 90s that a lot of local ceramicists realized they could open up studio residencies for the artists who were coming to visit. And she was one of the first to go there and experience this. Xian, he went there in that year. Well, I mean, it was the year his mother died, unfortunately. And then he, on his way back to Sydney from Beijing, he stopped off in Jingdezhen and spent some time there. And Weiwei, he'd just been back in the country for a few years. And I guess he was thinking of, he'd been at the markets in Beijing and he wanted to see where these things were made. He was quite fascinated by the historic reproductions in particular, and he actually commissioned some of his own historic reproductions, the Blue and White series, which he created alongside things like dropping a Han Dynasty urn, which is perhaps been known. And there's always been that ambiguity about whether it was a Han Dynasty urn or whether it was a reproduction. I asked him, but he can't be pressed on these things. So yeah, I think it was a matter of the history of the city and also just the personal circumstances of the artists, and their aesthetics just collided.
No, really fascinating. So I guess I now want to circle back to the question that was posed at the very beginning and the title of this conversation. So what is it about porcelain that has made it so attractive to artists? And here, we're thinking really not only about artists in China, but artists more broadly. And here I'm thinking about, the English artist Grayson Perry and the Seoul-based artist Yi Soo-kyung and her translated vases, which have certain affinities actually with Sin-ying Ho's work. So I'm just wondering, if you can just share with us your reflections on what is it actually about porcelain that has made it attractive not only to your four artists but to so many artists in China and beyond.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I asked myself when I was not only writing the thesis but when I was adapting it for the book. Particularly, I asked myself that because I had been asked by the reviewers what made this a particularly notable aspect of that impulse, and why these artists like Xian and Sin-ying Ho differed from artists like Grayson Perry or Yi Soo-kyung and their use of porcelain. And I found that for all artists, porcelain and ceramics in general have an appeal because it's a very tactile, it's a very physical medium. It's one that has a mythology which is almost inbuilt. There's all these ideas of the divine clay or the thing which is sort of making things with the matter of our own flesh, which go back for centuries. And that's obviously incredibly appealing. And we can see that in lots of different artists who use not only porcelain, but other forms of ceramics too. And then there's also I think the difficulty of the medium, the sense in which it's a challenge appeals to a lot of artists. Not to say that other media aren't challenging and difficult in their own way, but ceramics and porcelain in particular, porcelain clay is incredibly difficult to work with because it's so almost liquid that it's very difficult to actually make it sustain a shape, especially if you want the thinness of porcelain that a lot of the master ceramicists can achieve. And obviously you need a kiln, you need access to the clay, you need the minerals, you need all sorts of things in order to make things with porcelain. And the history of it, again, appeals to artists across the world. In England, there's a lot of artists in England, like Grayson Perry, who use ceramics and porcelain because there's a English history of porcelain, and things like the willow pattern is very appealing. So it speaks to certain aspects of their identity. In Korea, again, there's a long history of porcelain. Oops. Sorry. There's a long history of porcelain, very influenced by China. Lots of imports from China, lots of styles and aesthetics imported from China and Korea. So they can use that. So I guess it's almost something that, because it has traveled so far across the world in so many different contexts, it can become a really great vehicle or carrier of identity, many different forms of identity, almost ready-made. It's something that kind of offers almost a ready-made aesthetic. Oh, and you mentioned the link between Yi Soo-kyung's works, her translated vases and Sin-ying's. There is definitely a strong aesthetic link. I might briefly just summarize Sin-ying's working process because it's quite fascinating. It won't take long. So she makes vessels like this, like Identity. It's thrown on a wheel. It's quite a conventional looking vessel. But for these ones, almost recombined ones, she throws a number of vessels on the wheel, and then she actually makes molds of those, and then she chops up the molds and reassembles them into new molds and creates these reassembled vases, which she can then produce in endless quantities and modular as well. She can change the configuration of the molds to make new shapes. So it's this wonderful combination of the handmade, but also the modular and the mass produced. And again, that's something which I think very much appeals to artists, is the ability to do things like that.
No, well, thanks, Alex. I now want to come back to kind of what I guess is your own summation of the achievement of your book, of having arrived at, and here I quote you, a multifaceted definition of New Export China as both a category of artistic practice and a theoretical framework for approaching contemporary art in general. So that's a pretty big claim, but a very interesting one. So I wonder if you can talk to us just very briefly, because we're running out of time. We want to leave enough time for questions. But can you talk to us about the significance of this open critical framework that you've created, which is quite a significant thing to have presented us with?
yeah, it's quite an ambitious claim, I suppose, or an ambitious aim. Let me think. I suppose what I had in mind in terms of how to use it to approach contemporary art in general, I was kind of hoping that it might inspire in some people who read it perhaps a aspiration to move beyond ideas of singular definition or fixed contextualization of art. So rather than thinking of necessarily there being one Chinese art or one Chinese contemporary art, or even one Australian art or Australian contemporary art, was more thinking about how those categories and forms and aesthetics adopt different interpretations and different perspectives as they move between different contexts, in the same way that a porcelain vessel or another ceramic can adopt different perspectives and different functions as it moves not only across different places, but also across different times, so as it moves through history. And I saw that capability of ceramics as something that has that mobility and that adaptability and that multiple identity as something which all, I guess, all things have, but art in particular has, because it's such a great vessel for multiple different ways of thinking about the world. And I wanted to, and bringing in the concept of trans experience as well, I wanted to celebrate that mobility and celebrate, I guess, the ambiguity and the multiplicity and the complexity of things, in the way in which they can't really be reduced to singular meaning, but you have to kind of think about the multiple ways that things can be put together and things can be looked at.
Yeah, no, that's very, very compelling. So my final question, Alex, is what now? I was intrigued by your concluding chapter titled A Porcelain Aesthetic. And so I'm wondering whether you can just share with us briefly what your understanding or interpretation of a porcelain aesthetic is, and whether that indicates a future trajectory of your own research, or where in fact you think you might be headed now. You may not want to share that with us, but I thought I had to ask you the question.
Yeah, so I ended the epilogue that I added, which I called A Porcelain Aesthetic, was one of the new additions for the book that I didn't think about in the thesis. And it was one of the ways in which I wanted to project into the future and think about developments of the ideas. But the idea of a porcelain aesthetic grew from the idea of an ink aesthetic, which was something that was very much part of the exhibition Ink Art at the Metropolitan back in, I think, 2013. So ink being another highly traditional medium that has been adopted by contemporary artists. But as I argue at greater length in the book, ink is quite easily adapted for contemporary art because it has a very high art, very elite pedigree with ink landscape painting and calligraphy and things like that. So in a way, it was almost quite straightforward to adapt. There was quite a ready-made tradition to look back on and contend with. But ceramics are an art form that's almost undermined by their domesticity because they're functional, which is something we tend to think of art as not being, and they're humble and they can be quite debased in a way. They're perceived as something that's not really that's more of a craft than an art. So I found that was more challenging than ink. But the idea of an ink aesthetic, so the curator of that exhibition, Maxwell Hearn at the Metropolitan, he wrote in the catalogue that he started looking at the exhibition as a way to bring together things like hanging scrolls, examples of calligraphy, the things that we would ordinarily think of as ink art. But as he dove more into it, he found that artists were using digital capabilities. They were creating performances to do with ink. They were using it in ways that he had never imagined they would be using it. And that was something I found when I looked at works of porcelain art. The bulk of the book is dedicated to what we might think of as quite conventional works of porcelain art, in that porcelain is central to their meaning. But then in the epilogue, I introduced some of the works which changed that by introducing performative elements. So Xian, for example, has performed a couple times where he enacts one of his own busts. Artists like Geng Sui, whose work is on exhibition at the moment and has been for a while, who creates these wonderful animations where she draws out the material qualities of the porcelain as well as some of the historic qualities. So the idea of a porcelain aesthetic was just the way in which it becomes not just a material, but an aesthetic. It becomes something bound up with those ideas of fragility, durability, material allure, luxury, all those different aspects. And in terms of how that relates to my current work, I'm still writing a lot about porcelain. I'm kind of taking, I guess, taking a break from it in some respects, so I don't become the porcelain guy. But I do tend to return to it a lot. But I mean, my focus at the moment is very much on that link between materials and identity and the self and ways of constructing the self through materials, which I have been looking at predominantly through examples that include ceramics or porcelain. So I suppose that's how I'm carrying that idea forward at the moment.
No, it seems a really hot topic that, and you've cleverly hit upon it and produced this wonderful book. So thank you, Alex, for so generously sharing with us your further thoughts on aspects of the book. It's been really wonderful to hear you talk so eloquently.